The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning in late September, when the maple leaves were just beginning to turn copper and gold outside my kitchen window, and I was standing at the counter making coffee the way I had every morning for 43 years, in the same house with the same ceramic mugs and the same worn countertop that bore the stains of countless family breakfasts. But when I opened that envelope with the cream-colored cardstock and the elegant calligraphy spelling out my daughter's name, Veronica Adelaide Chen, and her fiancé, Marcus Wellington Reed III, I felt something inside me crack like ice on a winter pond, because there at the bottom of the invitation in letters so small I had to squint to read them was a line that said, "Intimate ceremony limited to immediate family only, and I am Diane Chen, her mother, the woman who carried her for 9 months, who walked the floors with her through colic and fevers, who paid for every dance lesson, every piano recital, every college application fee, every single thing she ever needed. And 6 months ago, I gave her $200,000 for this wedding money I had saved for 30 years from my work as a seamstress, taking in alterations and custom orders, working until my fingers ached and my eyes blurred because I wanted my only daughter to have the wedding of her dreams. And now, I'm holding this invitation that tells me I'm not invited to watch her walk down the aisle, and I need your honest answer right now. If your daughter did this to you after everything you sacrificed, would you have done what I did? Or am I the villain in this story? Keep that thought, because by the end, I want your verdict." I stood there in my kitchen with that invitation trembling in my hands, and I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the same clock my late husband Raymond bought at an estate sale 32 years ago, when we first moved into this house when Veronica was just a baby, and everything felt possible. And I remember thinking how strange it was that a piece of paper could weigh so little but feel so heavy, like holding a stone in your chest. And I read the line again, "Intimate ceremony, limited to immediate family only." And I wanted to laugh, because what could be more immediate than the woman who gave birth to you? But I didn't laugh. I just stood there while my coffee grew cold and the morning light shifted across the floor, and I thought about all the signs I had ignored, all the little moments over the past 2 years since Veronica met Marcus at that charity gala, where she was working as an event coordinator, and he was there with his family, the Reeds, one of the oldest money families in Connecticut, with a last name that opened doors and commanded respect in rooms I would never enter. And I remember the first time she brought him to dinner, how he looked around our modest dining room with its mismatched chairs and faded wallpaper. With this expression, I couldn't quite read something between curiosity and pity, and how Veronica kept apologizing for things that didn't need apologies. The chipped serving dish, the slightly wobbly table leg, the fact that I served pot roast instead of something more sophisticated, and I told myself I was imagining things, that she was just nervous, wanting to make a good impression. But then the visits became less frequent and the phone calls shorter, and when I asked about wedding plans, she would say, "We're handling it, Mom. You don't need to worry," in that tone people use when they're trying to be kind while pushing you away. And 6 months ago, when she came to me with spreadsheets and venue options and a budget that made my head spin, she said, "Mom, I know it's a lot, but Marcus's family has certain expectations, and I really want this to be perfect." And I looked at my daughter, who had always been practical, who had worked her way through state college, who used to clip coupons with me on Sunday afternoons, and I barely recognized her. But I said, "How much do you need, sweetheart?" And she said, 200,000 would cover most of it. And I felt my breath catch, because that was nearly everything I had saved, the money I had put away, dollar by dollar, from every wedding dress I altered, every hem I sewed, every intricate beadwork job I took that required me to work under a lamp until 2 in the morning. But when I looked at her face, so hopeful, so desperate to fit into this new world she was entering, I couldn't say no. So I went to the bank the next day and I transferred the money into her account, and she hugged me and said, "Thank you, Mom. I promise this will be the most beautiful wedding you've ever seen." And I held on to those words, "You've ever seen." because they implied I would be there to see it. But now I understood that was just something people say. Not a promise, just words. And I set the invitation down on the counter very carefully, as if it might explode. And I walked to the window and looked out at my small garden, where I grew tomatoes and herbs, and a rose bush that Raymond planted the year before he died. And I thought about how grief is a strange thing, because I thought I knew what it felt like when Raymond passed 7 years ago, after the stroke that took him in his sleep. But this was different. This was a living grief for someone who was still breathing, still moving through the world, but had chosen to cut me out of the most important moment of her life. And I wondered if I had failed her somehow, if I had been too permissive or not permissive enough, if I had held on too tight or not tight enough, if there was some crucial moment in her childhood where I made the wrong choice and set us on this path, and then I got angry, not the hot burning kind, but the cold settled kind that lives in your bones. And I thought about Marcus and his family, and the way his mother Constance had looked at me the one time we met at that restaurant where the menu didn't have prices, and she asked me what I did, and I said I was a seamstress, and she said, "Oh, how quaint," with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and I knew then that I would never be good enough for them, that my daughter was marrying into a world where people like me were invisible unless they were hemming your pants or catering your parties. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where Veronica had done her homework, where we had eaten 1,000 dinners, just the two of us, after Raymond died, where I had taught her to sew simple stitches when she was 8 years old, her small fingers fumbling with the needle and thread, and I opened my laptop, the one Veronica bought me 3 years ago, saying, "Mom, you need to join the modern world." And I logged into my email, and I started composing a message to her, and I wrote, "Dear Veronica, I received your wedding invitation today, and I noticed it says immediate family only, and I wanted to clarify if there's been some mistake, because I am your mother, and I gave you $200,000 for this wedding, and I assumed that meant I would be there. But I deleted it because it sounded bitter and accusatory, and I didn't want to sound like that. So I tried again. Sweetheart, I'm so happy for you, and I can't wait to celebrate your big day. But I'm a little confused about the invitation. Could you call me when you have a chance?" But that felt too passive, too weak, like I was begging for an explanation I already knew. And finally, I just closed the laptop and sat there in the silence of my house, and I realized I had been making excuses for her for months, maybe longer, telling myself she was just busy with wedding planning, that this was just a stressful time, that once the wedding was over, things would go back to normal. But I knew that wasn't true. I knew that she had made a choice, and I was on the wrong side of it, and I thought about calling my sister Ruth, who lived in California, and who had warned me 2 years ago when Veronica first got engaged, that I shouldn't give her all that money, that I should hold something back for myself. But I didn't listen, because what kind of mother holds back from her child? What kind of mother puts conditions on love and support? But now I wondered if Ruth had been right, if I had made myself too available, too easy to dismiss. Because when you give everything you have, you leave nothing for yourself to stand on. And I sat there for maybe an hour just thinking, and the coffee I made grew cold, and I didn't bother to reheat it, and then my phone rang, and for a second my heart jumped, thinking it might be Veronica calling to explain, to apologize, to say there had been a terrible mistake, but when I looked at the screen, it said unknown number. And I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up, and a woman's voice said, "Is this Diane Chen?" And I said yes, and she said, "Mrs. Chen, my name is Patricia Caldwell. I'm Marcus Reed's paternal grandmother," and my whole body went still because I knew who Patricia Caldwell was. Everyone in Connecticut knew who she was. Old money, real money, the kind that built libraries and hospital wings, the kind that appeared in society pages and historical records. And I said, "How can I help you, Mrs. Caldwell?" keeping my voice steady, even though my hands were shaking. And she said, "I'm calling because I understand you were not invited to your daughter's wedding." And there was something in her voice, not pity exactly, but recognition, like she understood something I didn't yet. And I said, "That's correct," because I wasn't going to lie or make excuses. And she said, "Mrs. Chen, I wonder if you might come to tea tomorrow afternoon. I have something I'd like to discuss with you in person. And I should have asked what about or why or what this was regarding, but instead I just said, "What time?" And she said, 3 o'clock, I'll send a car for you. And then she gave me her address, which I didn't need, because everyone knew where the Caldwell estate was, the massive property on the hill overlooking the Sound, with the iron gates and the long tree-lined driveway. And I said, I can drive myself, because I didn't want to feel like I was being summoned like some kind of servant. But she said, "Please allow me this courtesy, Mrs. Chen." And there was something in her tone that wasn't a request exactly, but wasn't quite a command either. So I said yes, and we hung up, and I sat there staring at my phone, wondering what on earth Marcus Reed's grandmother wanted with me, and why she was calling me about not being invited to the wedding. And I felt a small flutter of something in my chest. Not quite hope, but maybe its cousin and I spent the rest of that day trying to distract myself. I did laundry. I reorganized my sewing room. I worked on a bridesmaid dress alteration for a client. But my mind kept circling back to that phone call, and to the invitation sitting on my kitchen counter, and to the question of what happens when the person you love most in the world decides you're not enough. And that night, I barely slept. I kept replaying every conversation I'd had with Veronica over the past 2 years, looking for the moment when I lost her, looking for the sign I must have missed. And around 3 a.m, I got up and went to her old bedroom, which I had kept exactly as she left it when she moved out 6 years ago to take that job in the city. And I sat on her bed with its faded purple comforter, and I looked at the photos on her walls from high school and college. Veronica laughing with friends, Veronica in her graduation gown, Veronica and me at the beach the summer after Raymond died. Both of us sunburned and squinting, but smiling. And I wondered when I had become someone she was ashamed of, when my love had become a burden instead of a gift. And I thought about my own mother, who died when I was 23, before Veronica was born, and how she used to say, "Diane, you give too much of yourself away someday. You'll wake up and there'll be nothing left." And I had laughed it off, then thinking she was just being dramatic the way mothers are. But now sitting in my daughter's empty bedroom at 3 a.m, I wondered if she had been trying to warn me about exactly this. The next day, I woke early, even though I had barely slept, and I spent an hour deciding what to wear to tea with Patricia Caldwell. Because I knew that everything I chose would be scrutinized, that I was walking into a world where people could read your entire life story from the quality of your handbag and the cut of your coat. And I settled on a navy blue dress I had made myself last year, simple and well-fitted, with a modest neckline and 3/4 sleeves, and I paired it with the pearl earrings Raymond had given me for our 10th anniversary, and low heels that were comfortable, but not dowdy. And when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw a 64-year-old woman with gray hair, pulled back in a neat bun, with hands that were still nimble, despite the arthritis that was starting to settle into my knuckles, with a face that showed every year I had lived, but with eyes that were still sharp, still paying attention. And I thought, I look like what I am, a working woman, a mother, a survivor. And if that isn't good enough for Patricia Caldwell, then nothing will be. And at 2:30, the car arrived, a black town car with a driver in a dark suit who opened the door for me and said, "Mrs. Chen," with perfect politeness, and I got in, and we drove through town past the places I had known my whole life. The grocery store where I shopped, the library, where I took Veronica every Saturday when she was little, the park where Raymond and I used to walk on Sunday afternoons, and then we turned onto Prospect Hill Road, and everything changed. The houses got bigger, set back from the road behind stone walls and iron gates. The trees got older and more majestic. The whole world seemed to shift into a different register. And when we pulled up to the Caldwell estate, I felt my breath catch, because it wasn't just a house, it was a mansion. 3 stories of gray stone with white columns and tall windows, and gardens that looked like they belonged in a magazine. And the driver opened my door and led me up the front steps, and a woman in a black dress, who I assumed was some kind of housekeeper, opened the door and said, "Mrs. Chen, Mrs. Caldwell is expecting you in the conservatory." And I followed her through rooms that seemed to go on forever. Rooms with oil paintings and Persian rugs and furniture that looked like it had been there for generations. And finally, we arrived at a bright glassed-in room filled with plants and wicker furniture, and there, sitting in a high-backed chair with a china teacup in her hand, was Patricia Caldwell. And she was exactly what I expected, and nothing. Like I expected, she was in her late 80s, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored suit, with perfectly coiffed white hair and sharp blue eyes that took in everything. But there was also something fierce about her, something that reminded me of a bird of prey, elegant but deadly. And she said, "Mrs. Chen, thank you for coming. Please sit." And she gestured to the chair across from her. And I sat, and she poured tea from a silver pot into a delicate cup and handed it to me. And I took it, even though my hands were shaking slightly, and she said, "I imagine you're wondering why I asked you here." And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I am." And she smiled a small, tight smile and said, "I'm going to be frank with you, Mrs. Chen, because I believe in being direct. I did not approve of my grandson's engagement to your daughter." And I felt my spine stiffen, and I said, "I see," keeping my voice neutral, and she said, "Not because of your daughter herself, who seems perfectly pleasant, but because of the circumstances of their relationship. Marcus is my youngest grandson, and he has always been somewhat impressionable, easily influenced by people who see him as a means to an end." And I didn't know what to say to that, so I just waited, and she continued. "When Marcus told me he was engaged, I did what I always do. I had my people look into the situation, and what I found was interesting. Your daughter has been quite clever about positioning herself, but what really caught my attention was the $200,000. And my stomach dropped. Because how did she know about that? And she must have seen my face change, because she said, "Mrs. Chen, I have access to information that most people don't." And when I heard that the bride's family had contributed significantly to the wedding budget, I was curious because, in my experience, that's not how these things usually work when a reed man marries the groom's family, handles everything. And she took a sip of tea, and I did too, because I needed something to do with my hands. And she said, "So I dug a little deeper, and I learned some very interesting things about this wedding planning, and about who exactly has been making the decisions." And I said, "I don't understand what this has to do with me not being invited." And Patricia Caldwell set down her teacup and looked at me with those sharp blue eyes and said, "Mrs. Chen, your daughter didn't exclude you from this wedding. My grandson's mother did." And the room seemed to tilt, and I said, "What?" And she said, "Constance Reed, my daughter-in-law, is a social climber of the highest order. She married my son because he was a Reed, and she has spent the last 35 years trying to erase every trace of his actual personality and replace it with the image she thinks a Reed should project. And when Marcus announced his engagement to Veronica, she saw an opportunity. And I said, "Opportunity for what?" And Patricia said, "To make sure the wedding reflected well on the Reed family, which in Constance's mind means no reminders that the bride comes from working-class roots. Having you at the wedding, Mrs. Chen, would have been a reminder she couldn't control." I sat there in that beautiful conservatory with sunlight streaming through the glass and plants blooming all around me, and I felt something cold settle in my chest because Patricia Caldwell had just confirmed what I had suspected, but hadn't wanted to believe that I wasn't excluded because my daughter didn't want me there. I was excluded because someone else decided I wasn't good enough, and I said, "Did Veronica agree to this?" And Patricia said, "I imagine your daughter was told it was the only way to make this work, that if she wanted to marry into this family, certain accommodations would have to be made." And she paused and then said, "Mrs. Chen, I've lived in this world for 8 decades, and I know exactly how these women operate. They don't give ultimatums, They don't threaten, they simply make it clear that there is a right way and a wrong way to do things, and if you choose the wrong way, there will be consequences. And I thought about Veronica's phone calls over the past few months, the stress in her voice, the way she kept saying, Marcus's mother has very specific ideas about how things should be done. And I had thought she was just talking about flowers and seating charts, but now I understood she was talking about me, and Patricia said, I want you to know that I tried to intervene. When I heard about this, I called my son and told him this was unacceptable, but he is completely under his wife's thumb. And Marcus? Well, Marcus is a sweet boy, but he's weak. He wants everyone to be happy, and he doesn't understand that sometimes you have to choose sides. And I said, So why are you telling me this? What do you want me to do about it? And Patricia smiled, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who has been waiting for exactly the right moment to make a move. And she said, I want you to come to the wedding, Mrs. Chen, as my personal guest. And I stared at her, because that was not what I expected. And I said, Your personal guest. And she said, Yes, I am the matriarch of this family, and I can invite anyone I choose. And I choose to invite you because I believe Constance Reed needs to be reminded that she does not control everything and that actions have consequences. And I said, Mrs. Caldwell, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't want to cause problems for Veronica. And Patricia said, Mrs. Chen, your daughter took your money and excluded you from her wedding. She has already caused problems. The question is whether you're going to sit at home and accept it, or whether you're going to show up and remind everyone that you exist. And she leaned forward and said, I'm not suggesting you make a scene. I'm suggesting you attend with dignity as my guest, and let the people who tried to erase you realize they don't have that power. And I thought about it sitting there with my teacup growing cold in my hands, and I thought about all the times I had made myself small, made myself convenient, swallowed my hurt to keep the peace. And I thought about Veronica, who I loved more than anything, but who had chosen a man and his family over her own mother. And I thought about Raymond, who always used to say, Diane, you're too nice. Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself even when it's uncomfortable. And I looked at Patricia Caldwell, this 80-something-year-old woman who clearly had her own agenda, but who was offering me something I hadn't had in a long time, which was an ally. And I said, What do I need to do? And Patricia's smile widened, and she said, Just show up, Mrs. Chen. I'll handle the rest. And we talked for another 20 minutes about logistics and timing and what to expect. And when I finally left and got back in that black car, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I felt powerful not because of money or status, but because I had made a choice to stop accepting the unacceptable. And as we drove back down the hill toward my little house, I thought about what comes next, and whether I had just made a terrible mistake or the best decision of my life. And I pulled out my phone, and I looked at it for a long time before I finally typed out a message to Veronica. I heard you're getting married next month. How exciting. I hope everything goes smoothly with the planning. And I sent it before I could overthink it, and within seconds, she replied, Thanks, Mom. It's been so stressful, but we're getting there. And I typed back, I'm sure it will be beautiful. And I didn't mention the invitation or the wedding date or the fact that I knew exactly what had happened, because Patricia Caldwell had taught me something important, which is that silence can be a strategy, and that sometimes the best revenge is not confrontation, but presence. And I spent the next 3 weeks in a strange state of anticipation. I went about my normal life. I took in alterations. I had lunch with Ruth, who had flown in from California for a few days. I worked in my garden, but underneath it all, I was planning. I went shopping for the first time in years, and I bought a dress, not a cheap dress, not something I made myself, but a real designer dress from a boutique downtown, where the saleswoman looked at me with surprise when I walked in. And even more surprise when I actually bought something, and I bought shoes and a bag. And I went to a salon and had my hair done properly. And I looked at myself in the mirror, and I almost didn't recognize the woman staring back at me, because she looked like someone who belonged in Patricia Caldwell's world. And the night before the wedding, I barely slept again, but this time it wasn't from sadness. It was from nerves. Because I knew that when I walked into that venue tomorrow, everything would change. I would stop being the invisible mother, the woman who could be dismissed and forgotten, and I would become someone who demanded to be seen. And I thought about calling Veronica one last time, giving her a chance to fix this herself. But I didn't, because some bridges you have to burn to find out if you can fly. The wedding was at the Belcrest Country Club, which was exactly the kind of place I expected: all rolling lawns and white columns and a circular driveway where valets took your keys, and everything smelled like old money and fresh flowers. And I arrived exactly when Patricia told me to arrive, 15 minutes after the ceremony was scheduled to start, because she said, "We want to make sure everyone sees you walk in." And when the black car pulled up and the driver opened my door, I took a deep breath and I stepped out in my new dress, which was a deep emerald green silk with a fitted waist and a skirt that fell just below my knee. And I had my hair done in soft waves, and I wore the pearl earrings Raymond gave me and a new necklace I had bought just for this, a simple gold chain with a small pendant. And I looked like someone who belonged there. And that was exactly what Patricia wanted. And as I walked toward the entrance, I could feel people staring. And I knew they were wondering who I was. Because I didn't look like a seamstress. I didn't look like someone's working-class mother. I looked like a guest, like someone who had been invited. And I walked through the massive front doors into a foyer with marble floors and crystal chandeliers, and a young woman in a black suit approached me and said, "Are you here for the Reed Chen wedding?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "May I see your invitation?" And I said, "I'm Mrs. Caldwell's guest." And her whole demeanor changed, and she said, "Of course, right this way." And she led me through a hallway lined with portraits and into a large room where the ceremony had just begun, and I could see rows of white chairs filled with guests, all turned toward the front, where Veronica stood in a white dress that probably cost more than my car next to Marcus, who looked nervous in his tuxedo, and at the front of the room, standing under an arch of white roses, was the officiant. And I didn't look at Veronica yet. I couldn't, because I needed to stay calm. I needed to remember why I was here, and the young woman led me to a seat in the back, and she whispered, "Mrs. Caldwell will join you after the ceremony." And I sat down, and I finally let myself look at my daughter, and she was beautiful. Her dress was everything she had ever dreamed of, strapless with intricate beading and a long train that pooled behind her. And her hair was up in an elegant twist, with a veil that fell to her shoulders, and she was glowing in that way brides do when they think everything is perfect. And I felt my throat tighten, because this was supposed to be one of the happiest moments of my life, watching my only child get married. And instead, I was sitting in the back like an intruder, and I could see Constance Reed in the front row, wearing a champagne-colored gown that probably cost as much as my mortgage, and sitting next to her was Marcus's father, looking uncomfortable in his tuxedo, and scattered throughout the room were people I recognized from the society pages, people whose names appeared in the newspaper when they donated to museums or attended galas, and I was nobody in this room. I was just a woman in a green dress who had no right to be there, except that Patricia Caldwell said I did, and the ceremony was short, maybe 15 minutes, with traditional vows and a reading from Corinthians, and when the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," Marcus leaned in and kissed Veronica, and everyone applauded, and I applauded too, even though my hands felt numb. And then the couple turned to walk back down the aisle, and that's when Veronica saw me. Her eyes swept across the crowd in that way brides do, taking in the moment, trying to remember every face. And then her gaze landed on me, and I watched her expression change from joy to confusion to shock, and she literally stopped walking. Marcus had to tug on her arm to get her moving again, and as they passed my row, she stared at me, and I just smiled, a small, calm smile, and I nodded once, and she looked like she might cry or scream or both, but she kept walking, because what else could she do? And I know what you're thinking. Right now, some of you are nodding, thinking she deserved that, and others are judging me hard, thinking I'm a monster who ruined my daughter's wedding day. So drop a comment with your honest reaction, Team Diane or Team Veronica, because I genuinely need to know if I was justified. And then everyone stood and started filing out toward the reception area, and I stayed in my seat because I wasn't sure what to do next. And then I heard a voice behind me, "Mrs. Chen!" And I turned, and there was Patricia Caldwell wearing a pale blue suit that probably cost more than my car. And she looked absolutely delighted, and she said, "Well, that went perfectly." And I said, "She saw me." And Patricia said, "Of course she did, that was the point." And she linked her arm through mine and said, "Now comes the fun part." And she led me toward the reception. The reception was in a ballroom that looked like something out of a fairy tale, with round tables draped in white linen, and centerpieces of white roses and orchids, and a dance floor that gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and a band setting up in the corner. And Patricia led me to a table near the front, not the head table, but close enough that everyone would see me. And she said, "You'll sit with me and a few others. I think you'll find the company interesting." And I sat down, and I looked around, and I could see people whispering, looking at me, trying to figure out who I was and why Patricia Caldwell had brought me. And then Constance Reed appeared moving through the crowd like a shark through water, and she came directly to our table, and she said, "Mother Caldwell, how lovely to see you," with a smile that was pure venom. And Patricia said, "Constance, darling, this is Diane Chen, Veronica's mother." And I watched all the blood drain from Constance's face, and she said, "I see." And then she said, "I wasn't aware you were on the guest list." And Patricia said, "She's my guest, dear. I can invite anyone I choose." And Constance's jaw tightened, and she said, "Of course." And then she looked at me and said, "Mrs. Chen, how nice that you could make it." And I said, "Thank you, Mrs. Reed. Veronica looks beautiful." And Constance said, "Yes, well, we've worked very hard on this wedding." And I said, "I know, I helped pay for it." And the temperature at the table dropped about 20 degrees, and Patricia made a small sound that might have been a laugh, and Constance said, "If you'll excuse me, I need to check on something." And she walked away, her back rigid with fury, and Patricia leaned over and said, "Well played." And I said, "I shouldn't have said that." And Patricia said, "Nonsense." She needed to be reminded that she can't just erase people. And then other guests started arriving at our table, and Patricia introduced me to each one. "This is Diane Chen, the mother of the bride." And I could see the confusion on their faces, because why was the mother of the bride sitting here instead of at the head table? But no one dared to question Patricia Caldwell, and the reception got underway with champagne being poured and appetizers being served, and a series of toasts that all focused on Marcus's family and their distinguished history and their bright future. And no one mentioned Veronica's family. No one mentioned me. And I sat there eating tiny portions of expensive food that I could barely taste. And I watched my daughter at the head table looking miserable, and I saw her lean over and whisper something to Marcus, and he looked over at me, and then he got up and walked toward our table. And Patricia saw him coming, and she said, "Here we go." And Marcus arrived looking uncomfortable in his tuxedo, and he said, "Excuse me, Mrs. Caldwell." And she said, "Yes, dear." And he said, "I think there's been some kind of mistake. Mrs. Chen wasn't supposed to be here." And Patricia said, "There's no mistake, Marcus, I invited her." And Marcus said, "But my mother said." And Patricia cut him off. "I don't care what your mother said, Marcus. I am the head of this family, and I invited Mrs. Chen as my personal guest. And unless you'd like to make a scene at your own wedding, I suggest you go back to your table." And Marcus opened his mouth and closed it, and then he looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Chen." And I said, "For what exactly?" And he said, "For the confusion." And I said, "There's no confusion. Marcus, I understand perfectly what happened here." And he flushed red and walked back to the head table, and I could see him saying something to Veronica. And then Veronica got up and I thought she might come over, but instead, she walked quickly out of the ballroom toward the bathrooms, and Patricia said, "Should you go after her?" And I said, "No." Because I knew that if I went after her now, I would say things I couldn't take back, and after a few minutes, Veronica came back. Her eyes red like she'd been crying, and the reception continued with dinner being served. Filet mignon and lobster tail and vegetables, arranged like works of art, and then came the cake cutting and the first dance and all the traditional wedding moments. But everything felt hollow, because the person who should have been celebrating with Veronica wasn't her new husband or her new in-laws. It was me, and I had been deliberately excluded until I refused to stay excluded, and somewhere around 9 o'clock, Veronica finally came to our table. She approached slowly like someone walking toward a bomb, and she said, "Mom, can we talk?" And I said, "Of course." And we walked out onto a terrace that overlooked the gardens where fairy lights were strung through the trees, and for a moment neither of us spoke, and then Veronica said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I was invited." And she said, "By who?" Even though she already knew. And I said, "Patricia Caldwell." And Veronica said, "Mom, you shouldn't have come, this is my wedding day." And I said, "Exactly, it's your wedding day, and I'm your mother, and I gave you $200,000 to pay for all of this." And her face crumpled, and she said, "I wanted to invite you, I did, but Constance said," and I held up my hand and said, "I know what Constance said. Patricia told me everything." And Veronica said, "Then you understand why I couldn't fight her on this. Marcus's family is very important, and if I had pushed back," and I said, "What if you had pushed back Veronica, what would have happened?" And she said, "I don't know. Maybe they would have pulled their support or tried to stop the wedding." And I said, "And you chose their support over your own mother?" Veronica looked at me with tears streaming down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup, and she said, "It wasn't like that, Mom. You don't understand the pressure I've been under. Marcus's family has expectations and standards, and I had to prove I could fit into their world." And I said, "By erasing where you came from, by pretending your mother doesn't exist." And she said, "I wasn't erasing you. I was just trying to make things easier." And I said, "Easier for who?" And she didn't answer, because we both knew the answer was easier for everyone except me. And I looked at my daughter in her beautiful, expensive wedding dress standing in front of me like a stranger. And I said, "Veronica, when you were 8 years old, your father died, and it was just us. And I worked 16-hour days so you could have dance lessons and piano lessons and nice clothes for school. And I never complained, because that's what mothers do. But somewhere along the way, you forgot that. You forgot that I'm not just the woman who writes checks. I'm the woman who raised you and loved you and sacrificed everything so you could have opportunities I never had." And she said, "I know, Mom, I know all of that." And I said, "Do you? Because if you did, you wouldn't have taken my money and then excluded me from watching you get married. You would have stood up to Constance Reed and said, 'My mother will be at my wedding, or there won't be a wedding.'" And Veronica said, "That's easy for you to say. You're not the one trying to marry into a family like this." And I said, "You're right. I'm not, because I would never marry into a family that required me to cut off my own mother." And she flinched like I had slapped her. And then she said, "So what now? You came here to ruin my wedding, to embarrass me in front of everyone?" And I said, "I came here because I deserve to be here, because I earned the right to watch my daughter get married, and if that embarrasses you, then maybe you should think about why." And we stood there for a long moment in silence, with the sounds of the reception floating out through the open doors. Music and laughter and the clink of glasses, and then Veronica said, "I think you should go." And I said, "Is that really what you want?" And she said, "Yes." Her voice barely a whisper, and I nodded and I said, "Okay, I'll go, but before I do, I want you to know something." And she looked at me waiting, and I said, I will always be your mother, and I will always love you, but I will never again make myself small so that other people can feel big. And if that means we don't see each other for a while, then that's the choice you're making, not me." And I turned and walked back inside and found Patricia, who was holding court at our table, telling stories to the other guests, and I leaned down and said, "Thank you for inviting me, but I think it's time for me to leave." And she looked at me with those sharp blue eyes and said, "Did you say what you needed to say?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Good, then hold your head high and walk out that door like you own the place." And I did. I walked through that ballroom, past all those people in their expensive clothes, past the head table where Marcus sat looking miserable, past Constance Reed, who watched me with pure hatred, and I walked out through the marble foyer and down the front steps, and the valet brought my car around, and I got in, and I drove home, and only when I was safely in my own driveway did I finally let myself cry. Not pretty tears, but the ugly kind that come from somewhere deep and painful, and I cried for the daughter I had lost, not to death, but to ambition. And I cried for all the years I had spent building a life for her, only to be discarded when I was no longer useful. And I cried because I knew that walking out of that reception tonight meant that things between Veronica and me would never be the same, and that maybe that was okay. Maybe that was necessary, because you can't build a healthy relationship on a foundation of disrespect and erasure. And after I finished crying, I went inside and I took off my expensive dress, and I washed my face, and I put on my old, comfortable pajamas, and I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat in my kitchen at the same table where I had read that invitation 6 weeks ago. And I thought about what comes next, and whether I had done the right thing, and whether there was any way back from this, or if I had just permanently severed the most important relationship in my life. And my phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Caldwell. "You were magnificent tonight, dear. I'm proud of you." And then another text from Ruth. "I heard what happened. Are you okay? Call me." And I realized that news travels fast in small circles, and that by tomorrow morning, everyone would know that the mother of the bride had shown up uninvited, had confronted her daughter, and had walked out. And I knew that Veronica would probably never forgive me for that. But I also knew that I couldn't have lived with myself if I hadn't gone, if I had just sat at home and accepted being erased. And I thought about Raymond and what he would have said if he was still here, and I knew he would have been furious not at me, but at Veronica, because he had always believed in loyalty above everything else. And he would have seen this for what it was, a betrayal. And that night I barely slept again. But this time it was different, because I wasn't sad. I was angry, not the hot kind, but the cold, settled kind. And I decided that if Veronica wanted to cut me out of her life, then I would let her. But I wouldn't make it easy, and I wouldn't go quietly. And in the morning, I woke up early, and I made coffee, and I sat down at my computer, and I composed an email not to Veronica, but to my lawyer, because I realized that I had given my daughter $200,000 without any kind of contract or agreement, and that maybe it was time to ask for it back. Not because I needed the money, but because I needed her to understand that actions have consequences, and that you can't take someone's money and then treat them like they're worthless. My lawyer, Martin Greenfield, had been Raymond's lawyer, and then mine after Raymond died, and he was the kind of man who never seemed surprised by anything. So when I called him on Monday morning and explained the situation, he just listened in silence, and then he said, "Diane, I need to ask you something before we proceed. Do you actually want the money back, or do you want to send a message?" And I thought about that for a long moment, because it was a good question, and I said both. And he said, "Okay, then here's what we're going to do." And he explained that because I had transferred the money to Veronica without any written agreement, it would be difficult to prove it was a loan rather than a gift. But he said there were other options, and he suggested we start with a formal letter requesting repayment and laying out the timeline and the circumstances. And he said, "This will probably not result in you getting the money back, but it will make your position clear and it will force her to respond." And I said, "Do it." And 2 days later, Veronica received a certified letter from Martin's office, and I know she received it because she called me immediately, her voice shaking with anger, and she said, "Mom, what is this? What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm asking for my money back." And she said, "You can't be serious." And I said, "I'm completely serious. You took $200,000 from me, and then you excluded me from your wedding, and I've decided that's not acceptable." And she said, "That money was a gift." And I said, "Gifts are given freely with love. This was coerced. You made me believe I would be part of your wedding, and then you cut me out. So no, Veronica, that wasn't a gift, that was a transaction, and I want my money back." And she said, "We don't have it. We spent it on the wedding." And I said, "Then you'll have to figure out how to pay me back." And she said, "I can't believe you're doing this to me." And I said, "I can't believe you did what you did to me, but here we are." And she hung up on me, and I sat there with the phone in my hand, feeling both terrible and powerful. Because I had never stood up to Veronica like this. I had always been the accommodating mother, the one who said yes, who smoothed things over, who made sacrifices. But I was done with that. And over the next few weeks, things escalated. Martin sent another letter this time with a formal repayment plan, and Veronica hired her own lawyer. And suddenly, we were in a legal battle, and it was ugly and painful, and I hated every second of it. But I also knew I couldn't back down, because this wasn't really about the money. It was about respect and boundaries, and the fact that you can't treat people like they're disposable, and then expect them to just accept it. And then one day, about 3 weeks after the wedding, I got a call from Marcus, and he said, "Mrs. Chen, this is Marcus Reed," as if I didn't know who he was, and he said, "I'm calling to see if we can resolve this situation." And I said, "What situation?" And he said, "The loan repayment. My wife is very upset, and I think there's been a misunderstanding." And I said, "There's no misunderstanding. Marcus, I gave Veronica money for a wedding. I was told I wasn't invited to, and now I want the money back." And he said, "But Mrs. Chen, that money was a gift from a mother to her daughter." And I said, "Marcus, did your mother give money to this wedding?" And he said, "Yes, of course." And I said, "And was she invited?" And there was a long silence, and then he said, "That's different." And I said, "How is it different?" And he said, "Because my mother is." And he stopped, and I said, "Your mother is what, Marcus, wealthy, respectable part of your social circle?" And he said nothing, and I said, "The difference, Marcus, is that your mother was treated with respect and I wasn't, and I'm done pretending that's okay." And I hung up on him too, and that night, I got a text from Veronica. "Mom, please stop this, you're embarrassing me." And I wrote back, "I'm embarrassing you, interesting." And I didn't respond after that because what else was there to say? And then Patricia Caldwell called me and she said, "Diane, I heard about the legal action." And I said, "News travels fast." And she said, "It does in these circles, and I want you to know I think you're doing the right thing." Constance has been absolutely beside herself, and that alone makes this worthwhile. And I laughed, despite myself, and Patricia said, "But I also want to warn you this could get messy. Veronica might try to turn other family members against you. She might try to paint you as vindictive or unstable." And I said, "Let her, I know the truth, and that's enough." And Patricia said, "Good, because the truth matters, and what you're teaching your daughter right now is that she can't use people and then discard them without consequences." And after we hung up, I thought about that phrase, teaching your daughter, and I realized that's exactly what this was. It was a lesson, not a punishment, a lesson about respect and boundaries and the cost of betrayal. And I thought about all the lessons I had tried to teach Veronica over the years about kindness and integrity and standing up for what's right. And I wondered where I had gone wrong, where the message had gotten lost. But I also knew that people make their own choices, and that at some point, you have to let them face the consequences. and the legal process dragged on for weeks with letters going back and forth. And Martin kept asking me if I was sure I wanted to continue, and I kept saying yes. Even though it was costing me money, I didn't really have to spare because this wasn't about the money anymore. It was about principle. And then one day in November, about 2 months after the wedding, Martin called and said, "Diane, they want to settle." And I said, "What are the terms?" Martin explained that Veronica and Marcus were offering to repay $50,000 immediately, and the rest in installments over 5 years, and he said, "It's not the full amount, but it's something, and it means they're acknowledging the debt." And I thought about it because $50,000 would help. I could put it toward retirement, or repairs on the house, or maybe take a trip somewhere I had always wanted to go. But I also knew that if I accepted this settlement, it would be over. The battle would end, and we would all go back to our separate corners, and I said, "Tell them no." And Martin said, "Diane, are you sure?" And I said, "I want all of it, or I want an apology, and I want a real one, not some half-hearted, 'I'm sorry you feel that way,' but an actual acknowledgement of what she did wrong." And Martin said, "I don't think you're going to get that." And I said, "Then I don't want the settlement." And he sighed and said, "Okay, I'll let them know." And I hung up, and I sat there wondering if I was being stubborn or brave or just stupid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I settled now, I would be letting Veronica off the hook, letting her believe that she could buy her way out of accountability, and I wasn't going to do that. And the weeks passed, and Thanksgiving came and went, and for the first time in my life, I spent it alone because Veronica had stopped speaking to me entirely, and Ruth was with her husband's family, and I had no one else, and I sat in my kitchen eating a turkey sandwich and watching old movies, and I felt sorry for myself for about an hour before I decided that wasn't productive. And then Christmas came, and I didn't hear from Veronica at all. No card, no text, nothing. And I sent her a card anyway, a simple one that said, "Thinking of you, love, Mom," because I wasn't going to let her anger make me cruel, and I didn't expect a response, and I didn't get one. And then in January, Martin called again and said, "They're willing to go to $75,000 immediate payment, and they'll waive the installment plan." And I said, "And the apology." And he said, "No apology." And I said, "Then no deal." And I could hear the frustration in his voice when he said, "Diane, at some point you have to decide what you actually want here. Do you want the money, or do you want to be right?" And I said, "I want both, Martin. I want the money because I earned it, and I want an apology because I deserve it, and I'm not going to settle for less just because it's inconvenient." And he said, "Okay." And he hung up, and I wondered how much longer this could go on, how much more money I could spend on legal fees, how much more emotional energy I could invest in a battle that might never end. But I also knew I couldn't stop, because stopping now would mean admitting that Veronica was right, that I was just a gift giver, a checkbook, a mother who could be dismissed and forgotten, and I wasn't going to do that. And then one day, in February, 9 months after I had first received that wedding invitation, I got a call from an unknown number, and when I answered, a woman's voice said, "Mrs. Chen, this is Veronica." And my heart stopped, because we hadn't spoken directly in months, and I said, "Hello, Veronica," keeping my voice neutral, and she said, "I need to talk to you. Can we meet?" And I said, "About what?" And she said, "About everything." And I said, "Is Marcus going to be there?" And she said, "No, just me." And I said, "Okay, where?" And she said, "Can I come to your house?" And I almost said no, because I didn't want her in my space, didn't want her seeing how I had been living. But then I thought maybe that was exactly what she needed to see. So I said, "Tomorrow at 2. And she said, "Okay." And we hung up, and I spent the rest of that day and all of the next morning cleaning my already clean house, arranging things just so. And at exactly 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang, and when I opened it, there was Veronica looking thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under her eyes. And when she saw me, she started crying, and she said, "Mom, I'm sorry." And I said, "Come inside." And I made us tea, and we sat at the kitchen table, where we had sat 1,000 times before, and she said, "I've been thinking about what happened for months, and I keep trying to understand how it got so bad, and I realize now that I made terrible choices. I let Marcus's family pressure me into doing things I knew were wrong, and I justified it by telling myself I was protecting my marriage, but really, I was just being a coward." And I listened without interrupting, and she said, "When you showed up at the wedding, I was so angry, I thought you were trying to ruin the most important day of my life. But then later, I realized you weren't ruining anything. You were just refusing to be erased, and that's not the same thing." And she looked at me with tears streaming down her face, and she said, "I treated you horribly. Mom, I took your money and your love, and I gave you nothing in return, and then when you stood up for yourself, I got angry instead of apologizing, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." And I felt my own tears start to fall, and I said, "Do you understand why I'm asking for the money back?" And she said, "Yes, because I hurt you, and you needed me to understand that my actions had consequences." And I said, "It was never really about the money, Veronica. It was about respect." And she nodded and said, "I know that now." And we sat there crying together, and finally I said, "Where do we go from here?" And she said, "I don't know, but I want to fix this, if you'll let me." And I said, "It won't be easy, things between us are broken." And she said, "I know, but I want to try." And I reached across the table and took her hand, and I said, "Okay, then we'll try." And that was the beginning of something new, not a return to what we had before, because that was gone forever. But maybe something better, something built on honesty instead of obligation. And that night after Veronica left, I called Martin and said, "Drop the lawsuit." And he said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Yes, I'm sure." And he said, "Did she pay you?" And I said, "No, but she apologized, and that was always what I really wanted." And he said, "Diane, I respect that, but I think you're making a mistake." And I said, "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." And I hung up, and I sat there in my quiet house, and I thought about forgiveness, and whether it means forgetting, and I decided it doesn't. Forgiveness just means you stop letting the past poison the present, and I would never forget what Veronica did. But I could choose to move forward anyway, and now I'm sitting here telling you this story, and I still don't know if I made the right choices. I don't know if I should have gone to that wedding, or if I should have pushed the lawsuit all the way, or if I should have forgiven Veronica so easily. And I need your honest verdict. Team Diane or Team Veronica, drop your thoughts in the comments, because every perspective helps me understand this better. And next week, I'll be back with another confession from someone whose son chose his girlfriend's family over his own mother. And trust me, that story is even messier than mine. So if you want more raw, honest family confessions, hit subscribe, because we're building a community where people tell the truth about the hard stuff, the complicated stuff, the stuff nobody wants to admit. And I personally read every single comment, because your wisdom helps me make sense of my own story. So let me know where you stand, and I'll see you next week.